Do you like anime?
Yes!
Do you like RPGs? Are you a disgusting piece of shit and do you hate yourself? Well, I've got the game for you. Before we get into the video proper, there's a few things I want to say because I think they're either important pieces of context or represent something that contributed to my bias and probably colored my review of the game. Firstly, I want to say that regardless of the content of this video, I think it's really impressive that such a small team built this game. Seriously, the first 3 pages of credits have one person's name on them, and the next 2 pages are one other person. It's very apparent that this was a passion project, someone bringing their vision to life. The scale and polish of the game is seriously impressive for such a small team, and they've done some things really well. I think it's also important to let you know that personally, I'm not a big fan of turn-based combat. I don't find it fun. I don't like that you can't use skill to compensate for being underpowered, and there's a limit to how far strategy can take you before you just mathematically can't win a fight, so you have to grind. From the turn-based games I've played, I find that they all end up feeling kind of the same, and it gets boring watching the same animations over and over, especially when they don't really have a bearing on combat like a moveset in a fighting game would. It just feels like it takes a lot of time watching things happen without getting to do anything, and unless it has really unique and creative mechanics, I don't find it as engaging, varied, or interesting as something like third-person melee action, fighting games, or an FPS. I find that turn-based games really need a good story and well-designed abilities to be enjoyable. This is very much my opinion, though. I get that others may like it, and I also understand that it's probably a lot easier to create a turn-based combat system, especially under budget, time, and personnel constraints. Prior to playing this game, I played an amazing game from a bigger team with a bigger budget that had kind of similar vibes from the store page, but turned out to be one of the best things I've ever played, and I'm still thinking about it to this day. Considering this, the price of the game, $45 is a lot for an indie title, and the overwhelmingly positive review score, I probably went into this game with some pretty high expectations. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but I saw the cute and funny tags on it in the Steam store page, which really should have knocked my expectations back to the gutter where they would have been realistic. If you're lucky enough not to know what that means, you're better off staying that way.
You know you're a redneck when your gun rack has a gun rack on it.
You suck!
This review will contain spoilers. I'm gonna be honest, I don't like this game, so I don't really care about spoiling it. Also, it's been out for a while, so I can kinda say whatever I want. I will, however, out of the goodness of my heart, follow their content creation guidelines, which means I gotta tell you in the title that it contains spoilers, I can't sell footage for commercial purposes, and I'm not allowed to publicly share not safe for work content related to the game, which I wasn't planning on anyways because, spoiler warning, unlike the characters in this game, I'm not into 10-year-olds. The recording for the review was done on my second playthrough of the game. Not that I particularly enjoyed the first one, but I'd say it took until at least 70% of the way through the game for it to really start pissing me off on my first playthrough, whereas for this one I kinda just started off hating it. Also, f this game. With that out of the way, let's see what WitchSpring R is all about. WitchSpring R is a turn-based open-world game with visual novel-esque story segments that follows the journey of a young witch named Pieberry, spoilers for the next 3 seconds, her real name is Lucia, who, unsurprisingly, really likes pie and strawberries. The game is set in a sort of medieval fantasy kingdom called Vivelia, during a witch hunt in the aftermath of the humans finishing a power grab war against the gods. The story follows Pieberry as she sets out on her quest to save the world and find friends, family, and in the process herself. And pie. And strawberries. Most of the game takes a fairly lighthearted tone, but has its fair share of tragedy with some competently written emotional moments that regularly get the legs blown out from under them by the comical levels of plot armor that remove all manner of narrative tension from the game. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The main focus of the game is experiencing the story and observing Pieberry's growth from a bratty, naive kid who can barely cast a spell into someone who understands the dangers of the world but chooses to trust and hope in spite of them, and has the power to take down enemies and create real change. Has the power to watch somebody else get conveniently shoehorned in to take down enemies and create real change, when whoever you're fighting gets back up even stronger 5 goddamn seconds after you beat it for the millionth time. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Ultimately, WitchSpring R is a grand adventure complete with everything a fan of the genre might want from the standard fare of fantasy anime RPG trappings. Exploring a fantasy world, making a bunch of quirky friends from randos and past enemies, fighting a big bad religious organization, a forced romance subplot between an adult and a child, getting caught up in a giant complicated plot that concerns the fate of the entire world, and finding family, both old and new. The continent of Vevelia is about what you'd expect from a cute fantasy video game world, and does a solid job of being an environment for the story to take place in. It's got all the biomes and areas you'd think of, with forests, rocky shores, a beach island, icy tundra, mountain steppes, ancient temples, caves, and mines. The usual. The environments, animations, enemies, character designs, and soundtrack can be a bit generic at times, but for the most part they're quite charming and fit the style and mood of the game nicely. There's some cool and unique stuff like the steam and clockwork enemies in the mine, and sometimes stuff that feels a bit out of place like the guided missiles and steam robots. The world's backstory is also not too atypical of this kind of fantasy setting, with gods and magic and humans who want the power for themselves. There doesn't seem to be anything super unique about the environment itself, but I don't think that's a bad thing. It feels comfortable, familiar, alive, and reasonably believable, and I think the creators did a good job of it. WitchSpring R seems to be far more about the characters and the story than the particulars of the background it occurs over. As for the supporting elements of the game, the visual novel cutscenes are about what you'd expect and feature beautifully done character art. The soundtrack is nice and fits the theme well, but there's just not that much of it, so it can get a bit repetitive, especially if you're doing the same thing for a long time. This might be due to budget constraints or time limitation though, and it's not a big deal, so I can understand why it would be that way. As mentioned before, WitchSpring R is a turn-based combat game with open-world exploration. The main gameplay loop consists of the following components: exploring the open world, fighting enemies, solving puzzles, watching cutscenes, increasing your stats with training minigames, and crafting. When exploring the open world, you can gather resources and get into combat encounters. Each area is moderately sized and contains resource drops, groups of enemies, and some open world mini-boss fights. To get around, you can teleport to specific waypoints in some areas, or walk around on foot. Even with teleporting, you'll still do a fair bit of walking, and Pieberry is rather slow, so you'll need to summon a pet to speed things up. One thing that irks me about this system is that summoning rideable pets outside of combat still takes mana, which doesn't regenerate automatically, and your pet basically loses a turn if they have to wait for you to summon them in combat instead of already being summoned out in the world when the combat starts. This makes it a bit of a pain, and you have to find a pet that is both rideable and good in combat, or waste mana and time to manage pets. Also, some event triggers, but not all of them, and seemingly with no rhyme or reason as to which, will despawn your pet, so you'll need to menu and spend mana resummoning it occasionally.
I need to summon a pet, but guess what? It takes mana that I don't have.
Speaking of event triggers, trying to find them is a real mixed bag. Sometimes you'll get a quest marker or a hint that's actually helpful. Sometimes the most information you'll have is what section of the map you're looking in, and even then it's not always super specific. It's far from the end of the world, but if you're already feeling bored from other parts of the game, it can make scouring an area for an event trigger that much more of a pain. I'm glad they let you choose to leave a combat encounter if you accidentally run into it though, and you don't have to press a button to pick up resources after you do it the first time. Although I'm not sure why they ever make you do that, because picking up resources has no downside. The combat in WitchSpring R is about what you'd expect from a modern turn-based RPG title. Turn order and how often each combatant gets a turn is determined by their speed stat, and everybody chooses their attack and target when their turn comes up. Pieberry gets a guaranteed crit every 4 turns, and can use abilities with varying cooldowns. As the story progresses, you also get access to blessings that start with a cooldown and can only be used once per combat instance, so there's some strategy about when to do what and how to align ability cooldowns with the guaranteed crit. Pieberry and her allies also have AoE attacks that can hit multiple enemies based on their positions, so enemy configuration does matter as well. Summonable pets will provide extra damage and have abilities that they automatically use in place of their normal attack every few turns or so the only control you have over them is which enemy they target and whether or not you summon or dismiss them. However, none of them even have a health bar, so Pieberry is the one that takes all the damage. Now, in the right conditions, this combat system can actually work pretty well. If you're fighting a mixed group of enemies, and you're at the right place in your progression such that they do enough damage to keep you on your toes without making you need to focus solely on survival, and you do enough damage that you can take some of them down quickly to reduce the enemy damage output, then it's rather fun. You need to balance survival and damage output and make choices. Should I take out an enemy so they do less damage next turn, or should I play it safe and heal? Do I focus on taking down this one enemy now, or do I spread out the damage and keep all the enemies alive to maximize the effectiveness of AoEs? Do I do good damage now and take out a small enemy, or wait until the next turn and line up my guaranteed crit with my strongest attack, but risk taking extra damage in the meantime? Staffs are better for AoE magic, but swords can carry attacks over to multiple enemies even if they're far apart. There's some real strategy here if you get the right balance and build. Much like the setting and story of WitchSpring R, the preceding description of combat is, for the most part, complete fantasy. It's pretty rare to get a good group of mixed enemies who are all a threat but meaningfully different, and the balancing depends on your progression. None of the enemies seem to scale with you. Haven't done enough grinding? Looks like the entire fight is going to be focused on recovering while your pets do all the damage, if you can survive at all. Done a little too much grinding? You and your pets are going to steamroll the entire thing, and you won't even get time to use half your abilities. The game displays the turn order of the next several combatants to help you strategize, which is nice, but half of it's going to be taken up by your pets, and it doesn't account for speed buffs and debuffs wearing off, so you can't even trust it all the time. The balancing and game design really doesn't help the combat stay interesting either. Defensive gameplay is basically just using items and recovering moves to soak up as much damage as possible, since Pieberry's the only one that gets hit, and if she goes down, it's over. The enemies also tend to have a lot of health to make the battles last longer, which ends up limiting build variety and forcing you to prepare for a battle of attrition. Say you make a build with poor offensive capabilities, your pets can still output plenty of damage, but if you have poor defense and recovery, you're cooked. Unless you've done a ridiculous amount of grinding and offensive optimization, there's no way you'll be able to take down something big before it hits you hard enough to force you into focusing on defense and recovery. And at that point in your progression, you're probably strong enough to tank it anyways if your build is at all balanced, and thus the combat is just trivialized. Basically, a glass cannon build is completely infeasible, despite the fact that it would be the most fun way to play the game if it were. You need to have a fair bit of health, and unless you're way over leveled, you're gonna need to recover it fairly regularly. Many of the encounters are just several of the exact same enemy, or one big guy, maybe with a couple of minions. This means that specifically targeting some of them isn't really meaningful beyond sometimes choosing between a boss and a minion, or choosing to down the enemies one at a time or all together. By the time you're down to just one enemy, or if the encounter started that way, you'll just be spending the majority of your time watching your pets do the same unskippable animations you've seen 1,000 times without any input from you.
Time for another 5-digit snooze fest.
Spoilers for the DLC here, but it does actually introduce a couple of genuinely good mix-ups to the combat. The fight with Demon Kate includes captive villager targets that fail the encounter if you hurt them, so you have to focus her down before you can use any AoE attacks. This actually changed how I fought, as it prevented me from using the lifesteal AoE spell that my build was centered around, and limited the pets that I could use. The final DLC fight introduces support from the Temple Lords, which adds huge buffs to certain actions on different turns. These were genuinely cool mix-ups, but unfortunately, kinda too little too late. The puzzles in WitchSpring R are fine for a kid's game. They're generally pretty easy to figure out, but inoffensive and clever enough not to be a complete snooze fest. Stuff like block puzzles, stepping on tiles in a specific order so you don't step on anyone twice, that sort of thing. Occasionally you'll get one that could have used more explanation or more time to cook, like the temple block ride puzzle where the camera doesn't show enough to display the blocks that'll affect your trajectory when you make a move, or the underground temple water puzzle in the DLC that violates physics and never really explains what the f you're supposed to be doing. Generally, they're just okay. Cutscenes and dialogue segments are typically presented in a visual novel adjacent fashion, with dialogue boxes and lovely character art over the view of what's going on in the 3D game world. Mechanically, I don't really have any issues with them. The animations in the 3D game world range from okay to low-budget Yakuza sub-story, but the character art more than makes up for it. My one gripe with them is that they feature a lot of slow animations in the 3D world, and some bits of unskippable dialogue, and that the cutscene can't be skipped as a whole. You can shorten it by skipping through whatever dialogue boxes the devs allow you to, but the animations take a while, and this can get pretty frustrating if you ever have to watch a cutscene again after reloading a save. This problem is of course compounded by the fact that you can only save at Pieberry's house, and gets even worse at the end of the game where there's no hard save point, a lot of unskippable cutscene, and a very high chance of having to go back through the whole affair multiple times over because you got soft-locked on the later fights from being underleveled. These scenes make up the vast majority of actual story progression, and thus one's enjoyment of them heavily depends on the writing of said story progression. We'll go over this issue in a bit.
It must hard to what? I'm sorry. Did I see that right? It must hard too, huh?
WitchSpring R is a game centered around Pieberry's growth and development, both in terms of who she is and her power. In the game, you can play training mini-games at Pieberry's house to permanently increase her stats. Training sessions slowly become available over a fairly long cooldown and provide modest stat increases, so it feels like they're meant to be used as a little stat boost whenever you stop by home. You can choose to train for different stats, and you'll play a corresponding little minigame to determine how effective the training is. You can skip it for decreased rewards, but the minigames are perfectly serviceable little bits of occasionally janky fun that don't overstay their welcome. The training was a good idea, but it feels a bit underused. Unless you're doing a lot of side content or grinding for a long time, you're probably not going to spend enough time in the game to do all that much training, and if you're optimizing for a certain build, then you probably won't even play half the minigames. The final piece of the puzzle that is WitchSpring R is the crafting and upgrade system. As you progress through the story and explore the world, you'll gain access to a larger pool of craftable items like potions, spells, gear, and combat consumables that you can make out of the resources you gather through exploring and fighting enemies. This system works fine, and I have no issues with it. Get the resources, select what you want and how many, watch a 5-second animation, and get your stuff. Similar thing goes for the staff evolution system, where Pieberry can upgrade her staff down one of 3 trees. Not super innovative, but a perfectly good system. However, the metal equipment upgrade system is absolute butt cheeks, and I genuinely have no clue how anyone could have playtested this shit and thought it was fine to put in the final release. Conceptually, the actual minigame is fine. You get a hammer cursor, you hit with varying strengths on the equipment, and you try and get even enhancement over the whole thing. The real problem is the controls. Moving the cursor can only be done with the control stick, or WASD. For some reason the mouse doesn't work for this, and it's so slow. Once you finally get the cursor to where you want it, you open a menu, choose a strike strength, and hit the darn thing. Most equipment takes around 5 to 10 strikes in different locations. This feels clumsy and takes 10 times as long as it needs to. Once you're done with that, you get a pitiful 4% stat increase for doing it, or 2% if you don't do it well enough, and you need to replay it again every time if you want more buff. So, if you're looking for a meaningful change in your equipment strength, you need to sit there for like 20 minutes doing the exact same painfully slow and stupid minigame over and over and over again. The words waste of time are probably going to become fairly familiar to you over the course of this review, and I can't think of a single part of this game that exemplifies it better than this stupid upgrading minigame. Now, before we address the gigantic, blonde-haired, red-eyed elephant in the room, I'm going to take you through everything else regarding this game's storyline and characters. Basically, it's exactly what you'd expect from an anime RPG. Start out exploring the tutorial area, then head out into the world once you're ready. Go around all the areas, making friends and doing little tasks, and visit all the temples to get various blessings from the gods to help you on your journey. Get caught up in some big conspiracy thing involving a major corrupt religious organization, and fight against their soldiers, evil primordial forces, temple guardians, and flora and fauna that makes Australia look like a petting zoo. Of course, we need a moment or two where it looks like all is lost, and some dramatic twists about who's related to who, or wow, this person was actually that other person the whole time. All this culminates in a fight with the final boss, and then, just kidding, there is actually a bigger and finaler boss too, and then we all get a happy ending. Now, I won't bore you or myself with a detailed plot rendition, but here's the super quick notes so you've got some idea of what's going on. Prior to all the goings-on in the game, humanity waged a war against the gods and kind of won it. After this, they started hunting down the witches, who could use magic and are somewhat related to the gods. At the start of the game, Pieberry lives alone in the forest. She meets a bird, explores a temple, chats with one of the disembodied gods in a magic well and gets a blessing of power, and then heads out into the world to look for Pie. She's being hunted by the soldiers of the Pope, who rules Vavelia after the humans defeated the gods in the Spring War. She meets another witch with no powers who she thinks is her mom but isn't, and makes a few other friends. Pieberry makes her way around the continent to gain blessings from other gods at their temples, occasionally clashing with the forces of the Pope, and sort of befriending some of the characters important enough to have names. At some point, she conveniently stumbles upon an anti-Pope resistance squad and starts working with them. This is like more than halfway through the game at this point. She helps them prepare, ends up getting captured by the Pope and almost dying, meets her real mom, who's one of the gods, and the friend she thought was her mom just dies at some point. Justice, the jack commander who's been a racist at the whole time, gets captured by the anti-Pope faction, and the Pope basically hangs him out to dry. So then he has a rushed boohoo segment and joins up with the anti-Pope squad after he gets kicked out of the Pope's forces, and the atrocities of the Pope's faction begin to have immediate negative effects on him personally. Everybody invades the Pope's castle in a big anime working together moment, and then we beat the Pope, and surprise, the Pope actually just wanted Pieberry's power and all the blessings to fight the real final boss, who's a dragon that has gone completely unmentioned until now, but was actually the mysterious guy in disguise as the Pope's top soldier. He's trying to absorb all the dark magic so no one else is affected by it, so he's not totally evil, but also he's like wrecking the town, so Pieberry gets the last blessing that's supposed to revive all the gods, but what a surprise, it didn't work. You know what would help in this moment? a forced romance subplot between Pieberry and the most unlikable wad in existence. Good guy soldier leading the anti-Pope squad, who was heavily hinted to be Justice's dad, turns out to be Justice's dad and sacrifices himself to kill the real final boss's first form. Then you beat the real final boss, but it doesn't count because nothing in this game matters, and actually all of the gods did revive, and they all get up to kill the real final boss for real, and then the game just f***ing ends. Finally, Justice decides to grow emotionally dependent on a 10-year-old girl to fulfill his dad's dying wish. Then the DLC goes like this. First, we have a Justice moment, which I will discuss later. Then the big final boss is chill now, but maybe he hasn't really learned anything, we're not sure. All the witches/deities got revived because Justice was about to have an actual moment of character development and maturity about his guilt, but we can't have that. Instead, we bend the whole story and ask a higher power to simply undo all the bad stuff. This massively cheapens the significance of the entire Spring War and Witch Hunt and the plot of the entire game, just so that the writer's perfectest little boy won't have to grapple with the consequences of his own actions that he knowingly did on purpose. It's like the writers knew he was still extremely unlikable as a character and are trying to speedrun damage control in a desperate bid for approval of the disgusting relationship they wrote. Next up, surprise, there was actually an underground ancient civilization the whole time, again unmentioned until this point. Presumably they died out because they lost something important behind the stupidest fucking puzzle ever. And wouldn't you know it, there's a dark magic well down there too, just like the magic wells of the deities at the shrines. It's like two sides of the same coin, sort of something. Wow, that's a cool revelation that doesn't really end up meaning shit, but whatever. Pieberry apparently doesn't have the connection to dark magic because she's made from the purified magic of a deity. Apparently the deities purifying themselves didn't sever their connection to dark magic, but it didn't end up getting passed down to their offspring either, despite them being made of their parent deity's magic, and the deities weren't separated from dark magic. I don't know, this shit makes very little sense at this point, and it doesn't matter at all anyways. What it does do is make for a very nice shoehorned excuse for why Pieberry actually needs to be here. Not because she's strong or anything, simply because it was preordained at her birth and completely out of her control that only she can fight the dark magic because she was born disconnected from it. Great choice for a game centered around the main character growing strong. Also, Jude, the final boss guy, is here too, and he's trying to absorb all the dark magic again, so the gods help us beat him up, and then he just offs himself to get rid of a bunch of dark magic that he absorbed. Apparently, it was a large amount of dark magic, but nowhere near all of it, so I don't really know how worth that was. Also, does dark magic regenerate? Is there a finite amount of it in the world? I don't know. Jude's sacrifice may or may not have been entirely for nothing, but either way, it was kind of a well-written moment and pretty in line with his character. Now, one thing you won't get from my quick and dirty plot summary is an idea of the moment-to-moment writing, especially surrounding the more significant fights in the game. I don't really have a problem with the general concepts and the overarching plot of the game. It's fine if a bit generic and predictable at times, but I think the moment-to-moment writing surrounding the boss fights especially is one of the worst parts of this game. Not the absolute worst part, we'll get to that in a bit, but this game almost always managed to disappoint me whenever there was a big fight or other climactic conflict event, because they typically go something like this. First, you get into the fight. Maybe there's a bad guy in the way where you need to go. Maybe Pieberry and the enemy kind of just stumble into each other. Maybe a full group of heavily armored goobers manage to sneak up on her. Or some guy who really should be on your side decides he needs to test you to make sure you're worthy, even though you've got a bunch of blessings from multiple literal gods already. Next, you do the fight. Previously mentioned problems with the combat system apply here, and are especially bad since most boss fights have one or very few enemies and very big health bars. Plus, they typically represent large jumps in difficulty, so it's hard to predict how much you'll need to grind to fight them properly based on other fights in the area. Next, you win the fight. Whether you barely scraped by and eked out a meager victory, or you moonwalked in backwards and twerked on the enemy double dump truck booty style, the enemy will immediately have a JoJo brand pull moment and get right back up with some brand new power, summon someone else way stronger, and you'll get a cutscene segment where they fold you like a cheap plastic chair in seconds. The writers will provide some flimsy justification for how you managed to beat them when, actually, they're way stronger than you. Either they were just testing you, or their magic wasn't at full power yet, or it was just one of them and now there's 5, or some other stupid bullshit. Since, obviously, at this point, you can't handle the situation yourself, the writers will have a JoJo brand pull of their own, and one of Pieberry's allies just so happens to be there at the exact right time. Or they'll write in somebody completely new and use this as their character introduction. The new person will completely handle everything and fix the situation when Pieberry is up proverbial creek without a proverbial paddle. Someone else saves the day, Pieberry gets out of it unscathed, and nothing of consequence really happens. Everything is resolved so quickly by an outside party that there's no time for tension to build or consequences to set in, so it ends up feeling like nothing really matters. Even the final boss, after you defeat him twice in a series of long, hard fights, he gets up immediately, grows a bajillion times stronger, and then all the gods show up together for the first time in the entire game and kill him in a fucking cutscene, and that's just it. The ultimate effect of this is that Pieberry almost never wins or escapes danger by her own power. She wins a fight, it gets revealed that they had Blue Eyes White dipshit face down in defense position, and now that you've activated their dark magic trap card, they're actually way more powerful, and we need to rely on whoever the writers can most conveniently, or ham-fistedly sometimes, shoehorn into that particular location to save Pieberry's ass just in time. It's fine to do this a couple of times, but when you start seeing it happen more often than not, you stop wondering, how is Pieberry gonna make it out of this one? And start wondering, which character or power are the writers gonna pull out of their ass to save Pieberry this time? Or are they gonna write in a new one for this encounter? She never has to be clever or strong or anything to get herself out of real trouble, because some deus ex machina is always there just around the corner to save her. Needless to say, this kills the tension in the story pretty fast. It's kinda hard to feel worried or anything when things start looking dire in the story, because you know Pieberry has enough plot armor to stop anything as soon as it starts. The Baku magic stall for time until Blessing Resurrection thing when she kind of died was actually a pretty cool idea, using previously introduced concepts that didn't seem relevant yet. This was pretty late in the story, and by that point it was pretty impossible to feel any degree of suspense, given the amount of bullshit the writers had already done to pull her out of every bad situation so far. By the end of the game, you'll probably be wondering why the gods chose Pieberry to carry all their blessings and power, when in reality she ends up being a borderline useless liability who always needs someone else to step in and do the hard work. It feels like the only reason they chose her over any of the actually competent fighters in this game is due to the circumstances of her birth and her ability to befriend people who are actually worth something in a fight. Although even that's pretty circumstantial. Take Justice deciding to quit the Pope's forces, or her stumbling upon the anti-Pope faction. Neither were things that she did, both of them were kinda just down to luck. At this point, I've basically spoiled the whole game and probably turned you off of ever playing it, so I think it's a good time to start talking about the twists. Many of the twists in this story are either painfully predictable or completely out of left field. There are some that are actually solid, like Black Joe having been Pieberry's mom's guardian animal the whole time, and knowingly protecting Pieberry, but also trying not to have her regain her memories. The Baku Magic Resurrection one's also pretty good. There's just enough information there in these twists for it to make sense once you do know, but not enough context until then for it to be really predictable. For example, we know that the Bakus eat dust infused with Pieberry's magic, we learn that Pieberry is a deity, and we know that coalescing significant parts of their magic is important to sustaining or reviving a deity. When Black Joe uses the Bakus to infuse Pieberry's magic back into her to keep her alive long enough for the resurrection blessing to come back, it brings together all of these concepts that were each introduced in different contexts. Great work! Contrast this with the Pope telling Justice, "Are you sure your dad's dead? Maybe he's not." And then later, Verstein talks to Justice and is like, "Wow, tell me how you feel about your family." And Justice is like, "Do you know my dad?" And Verstein says, I don't know. Maybe I'll tell you about it later. And like, obviously he's Justice's dad, and then he turns out to be Justice's dad. Crazy. I called the Miro one early, even though it wasn't as bad, and I also called them resurrecting Justice's dad like a minute before it happened on my first playthrough of the DLC.
They're bringing back his dad, aren't they?
Not all of the twists are bad, but they're definitely a mixed bag. All the issues with the writing are a real shame because I think they actually did a good job creating some of the characters and emotional moments in the story. I really like the dynamic between Black Joe and Pieberry. They start out with her basically threatening him into doing her bidding, and he fights against every choice she makes, saying that he doesn't want to be exposed to danger. Later on, their relationship develops into trusting each other and taking on danger together, and then near the end you get the twist, that Black Joe knew who she was the whole time and was trying to protect her. It recontextualizes their entire relationship. Black Joe may have hidden his motive, but he still tried to go against Pieberry to protect her, and later learned to trust her judgment in the face of danger, so the development of their relationship is still meaningful despite the different context. Alfredo is a really funny character, and I like how Pieberry helps him grow from a scared soldier into someone who's brave enough to stand up against monsters and society both in order to do what he thinks is right. He becomes brave, but keeps his sensitive side and pushes to find his own path of what he wants to do. Livia, one of the higher-ups in the Pope's army, has never been enthusiastic about hunting witches, but won't disobey orders either. She starts out struggling to balance her military career, her desire not to kill any witches, and her friendship with Justice, who thinks his dad was killed by a witch. She tries to keep a low profile and stick to training local guards, but ends up fighting with Pieberry anyways. At first, she's complacent and doesn't want to hurt anyone, but also won't openly defy the Pope. Eventually, she learns to trust Pieberry, and turns to using her status in the Pope's army to cover up the fact that she's working with and protecting a witch. This doesn't end up going too well for her in the long run, but I think her characterization and development were well done. Even more minor characters like Canna, Luna, and Michelle have some good scenes, and they're written with understandable motivations and act accordingly. The DLC even showed a hated character like Kate having a bit of real development, and I think they handled Jude's motivations and actions really well. He still wanted to handle the dark magic himself, and he still went against everyone to do it, but this time he knowingly sought out sacrifice instead of trying to gain power for himself. The characters are definitely WitchSpring R's strong suit. Additionally, I think a lot of the emotional moments were actually pretty well written. Removed from the greater context of this game and standing on their own, some of these moments would have been downright tragic and really well done. Pieberry thinking that Anna is her mom, and then realizing that even though she isn't Anna's long-lost daughter Miro, they can still be an important part of each other's family. Pieberry watching Anna die to save her, or Anna coming back just for a moment to see a half-conscious and dazed Miro, and only be able to spend a minute with her before having to say goodbye forever. That was sad. Also, the same thing kinda happened with Justice and his dad. However, by the time it was far enough into the game that all these situations were adequately set up to get a good payoff, I was so frustrated and felt like nothing had any significance or consequence anymore, so the moments didn't really hit as well as they could have.
Thank you for that emotional moment. Delivered with all the gravitas of a loading screen tooltip.
Also, literally like first thing they did in the DLC was roll back all consequences from the entire game, so... Anyways, it's obvious from the characters and the emotional moments that whoever wrote this game is actually capable of good writing. So I'm not sure how the they managed to do this. I've put this off long enough, so let's address the elephant in the room and the reason for that 6th disclaimer. I'll put it bluntly, the forced romance subplot between Pieberry and Justice is the worst part of this game by far. Without it, this would just be a mediocre indie title with some really good points and a lot of overarching problems that make it boring to play and frustrating to experience. I also might have felt a bit bad about how negative a lot of my review has been so far, especially since this game is obviously someone's passion project. However, I can't possibly feel anything but disdain for someone who sees fit to portray what they did in the way they did it, and I'll tell you why. Now, if you've played the game, you'll know that Justice is a complete jackass throughout probably the first 75 to 80% of the game. He thinks his dad was killed by a witch during the Spring War, and so makes it his life's work to hunt down and kill witches, working as a commander in the Pope's army. Apparently, he's killed a bunch of witches, although if I remember correctly, there's also talk that he's killed none and just captures them so they can be subject to experimentation and torture that he knows leads to a painful and premature death, so I don't know if that's really better. Anyways, his desire for revenge seems completely insatiable, not wanting to just get even, but to exterminate all witches regardless of age or innocence. Outside of that, he's basically your typical self-insert male protagonist from whatever garbage isekai anime is popular to make fun of these days. He's confident, has a tragic and mysterious backstory, good at fighting, and he's aloof and cool in a way that makes him an emotionally stunted and empathy-devoid asshole, but everybody gives him a pass for it because he's good-looking or something. Basically, he's a 12-year-old boy's idea of cool fantasy guy. When he gets saved by Pieberry on multiple occasions, he continues to be resolute in his hatred of witches, and even when Pieberry tells him that her mom was killed by soldiers during the Spring War, and despite that she can still be compassionate, he basically just brushes it off. No amount of appealing to empathy works on this dumbass because he has none, and he's less mature than a literal 10-year-old. It's not until he faces severe negative personal impact and really has no other choice that he decides to change. He only stops working for the Pope and reconsiders what side he should be on when the Pope orders his execution and turns all of his allies on him, not when he engages in self-reflection and reconsiders his views, because he never does that. After all, it wouldn't be very emotionally detached cool guy of him. The writers then go for the character rehabilitation any % speedrun and try and jam as many tragic boo-hoo, I'm sad about my dad moments and quirky we're friends now bits and quips between Justice and Pieberry as they can into the 4 available minutes left in the game's runtime for that sort of thing. After this guy spent literally hours of the game's runtime being a total wad bent on killing and capturing witches and ignoring any and every indication that he was doing something wrong, 4 minutes of half-heartedly trying to scrub this guy's character clean just really doesn't cut it. I'm guessing they were short on time here at the end of the game because a lot of the stuff near the end seems like it could benefit from having a bit more time in the oven, but they should have just cut this shit if they didn't have time for it. I mean, they should have just cut this shit even if they did have time for it, but unless you have the attention span of a goldfish, you'll still be hating Justice by the time the story is desperately trying to ship him with Pieberry. And since she has actually been kind of a good person the whole time, it's just disappointing to see the plot chain her to this loser. Also, Verstein's death scene doesn't help, where he basically tells Justice to fill the hole in his heart with gentleness, heavily implied or outright stated to be from Pieberry, I don't really remember.
Oh, that's a baseball!
But yeah, dude, you spent the whole game threatening this girl because you can't process your daddy issues and refuse to reflect on your views, and she's been kind to you despite that the whole time. Now that you've spent a day working with her for your own benefit without really apologizing properly, go ahead and rely on her to support you through your trauma and grow emotionally dependent on her for the rest of your life. Real fair. This was obviously a bad scene, but I think Justice showing any amount of emotional maturity and making any effort to work on himself would have been so out of character that the story would implode.
Oh, come on, Meg. I bet if we fixed it up a little bit, it could be a piece of crap.
Speaking of things that are out of character, as soon as Justice hits the screen, Pieberry has to drone on about how handsome he is, which I think is meant to be funny because it unsettles him, but Pieberry never really expresses interest or attraction outside of this, so it just comes out of left field. She's typically compassionate to her enemies, but this feels really weird and uncomfortable. Plus, he's mean and dismissive to her for the vast majority of the game, so it's kinda just strange. Overall, the Pieberry times Justice romance thing feels out of character for both of them, and Justice really doesn't get enough time to get all the grime of his past actions scrubbed off his character by the time they really want to turn him into a romantic interest. It doesn't feel like either of these people are ready for a relationship, not that Justice should really be dating anyone, nor has there been any real lead-up or indication for either of them wanting one, so it kinda just feels like the writer saw they had important boy character and important girl main character and felt compelled to mash them together whether or not it was a good idea. Now, if you play this game and you're paying attention to the math, you could very well come out of it thinking that there's a bit of a problematic age gap in this relationship. Justice quotes that his dad leaves him before the Spring War when he was 7, and Ethan says that the Spring War was over a decade ago. This means that Justice is at the very least 17 and likely somewhat older, depending on how long before the Spring War his dad left, how long the Spring War took, and how much over a decade ago the Spring War was. Technically, the only hard number we get for Pieberry's age is 10 near the beginning of the game, so a romance between them is more than a little bit disgusting. Closer inspection of later game plot events and reveals will tell you that this is probably incorrect, but also probably not as wrong as you'd hope for it to be. The real story is that Pieberry was likely born prior to the Spring War, given that she has memories with her mother who was killed, kind of, in the Spring War. In these memories, she appears to be very young, but I don't think a specific age is ever mentioned. At some point, presumably during the Spring War, Pieberry is taken away to the forest by Black Joe, and again, it's not mentioned when. The only other hard number we get is that Black Joe dipped Pieberry in the magic draining water in Pudding Cave when she was 8 years old. This was to take away her memories of her mother and the Spring War, because at the time she tried to attack the humans for revenge. As I was searching around to see the fanbase's views on this relationship, I found that some commenters on Reddit used this to say that she's 18. They assume that this happened immediately after the Spring War, which was a decade ago. 10 plus 8 equals 18, and this would put the two at approximately equal age. However, this dialogue doesn't confirm she's 18, only that she was 8 sometime after the Spring War. It's also entirely possible that she was carried away at 4 years old and only felt ready and willing to attack the humans once she was 8. There is also some fairly strong counter-evidence from dialogue within the game. After she grows physically from gaining her mother's magic, Black Joe reminds her on multiple occasions that she's still a kid, although these are before he reveals that she was dipped in the pond and lost her memories. That said, he's revealed a lot of other stuff and that he hasn't been truthful about her past, so I don't see why he's got much reason to be lying at this point. Additionally, the bartender in Favelia immediately tells her to get lost even after she's grown to look older, saying that kids can't drink anything we serve here, strongly implying that she's still perceived as a kid. In the DLC, he basically switches to saying, "We'll get you anything you want," but there's like less than a week between those two events, so it's a bit strange. Ultimately, we just aren't really given enough information. I think there's a reasonable amount of evidence to call this kind of gross, but enough of a counter-argument to manufacture plausible deniability the other way. I think it's important to look at the information we do have. We've got a boy who's confirmed to be at least 17, being shipped with a very likely younger girl of indeterminate age who looks, talks, sounds, and behaves like a kid and has the lived experience of a 10-year-old. Can't say that's a good look. Whether or not the age gap is problematic, though, I think I've made a solid case that the relationship was forced and poorly written, and that Justice is far from a likable character by the time they try to put him together with Pieberry. The final note of the game and the starting point of the DLC are both about this relationship between the two of them, which makes it seem like the devs thought they cooked with this, but just left me thinking, was the rest of the game really so worthless that we didn't have anything better to end it off with? This was our big finale? One thing I think the game does well, although it feels a little bit dirty to say anything positive of it after that, is the training and improvement mechanics to foster a feeling of growth. Pieberry can get stronger through a number of means like training, leveling up, crafting stronger gear, improving gear, gaining new pets, making new spells, using stat boost items, touching grass, and progressing through the story. All of these are permanent increases to Pieberry's power and survivability, so it feels like you're really growing stronger with each thing that you do, and you're meaningfully preparing yourself to continue Pieberry's story. The lack of enemy scaling actually works in favor of this. The more you grow stronger, the more you can outmatch your enemies, and you can come back after having gotten stronger and beat fights that you couldn't before. Unfortunately, this feeling of growth only really applies in a vacuum because everything else in the game seems specifically designed to make Pieberry feel weak and useless and your efforts to feel wasted. The combat being the way it is means you'll end up tanking and have to grind a lot to trivialize the combat, or focus on health and let somebody else handle all the damage. Pieberry doesn't really do that much more damage than the pets, unless the gods are helping her or she's using their blessing, and she really doesn't feel all that impactful or important, especially when the pets get like 10 times more turns than her. Her turn usually doesn't mean any more than the pets, and often it's actually far less consequential. She has to take all the damage, which makes her feel like a glorified punching bag, and means she has to spend a lot of time healing, so she can contribute even less offensively. If the pets are just as strong as Pieberry, and probably way tougher, what's even the point of her being here? Is she only as strong as some mind-controlled baby pig, even after all that growth? Is she just along for the ride to get the crap beaten out of her? The writing is probably the bigger culprit in ruining the feeling of growth. You spend all this time training, gathering materials, leveling up, trying to fight tougher and tougher enemies, getting tested by the temple guardians, and so forth, only to get completely washed and end up relying on someone else when things actually get serious. Every time she fights something big, it just gets up bigger and stronger afterwards. This makes it feel really disheartening and cheap whenever you finish a fight. You spend a whole bunch of time fighting a long battle, only to find out that not only did you not actually defeat the enemy, but they were only using like 10% of their power, or they were just testing you, and you actually wouldn't stand a chance against them if they were really trying. What then was the point of fighting them, and did I really grow strong if I can only win when my opponent is babying me? Also, Pieberry never gets out of trouble on her own accord. She wins a fight, they get up immediately and get the upper hand, and someone else has to save her, and it happens over and over again. Arwa lightnings Crown as soon as he almost kills her in the lack, Robin gets her out of the Pope's dungeon, Black Joe fights off the Harvest Executor to bring her back home, she needs everyone's help to fight Crown and the Pope at the end, and Jude gets right back up after you beat him, and then she needs the gods and the dragon to come fix things. She can't even do the final DLC battle without the backup of literally all of the gods. Plus, the story loves to imply that the main source of her power is the blessings of the gods, not her growing and getting stronger herself. Not only does this kill all tension in the story, but it makes it feel like Pieberry can't do anything herself and always has to rely on someone who's actually strong to help her. Why can't she become strong enough to solve her own problems sometimes? Altogether, this stuff makes your presence in the story feel like just a big waste of time in a game that already isn't shy about blatantly wasting your time. This game loves wasting your time, just not always in the way you'd expect. Even if you ignore its grindy nature on higher difficulties and the fact that the whole game feels like a stupid waste of time as previously discussed, there are just fundamentally bad gameplay decisions that make this game a waste of time. I think the smithing minigame is a prime example of this, but you really just can't do anything quickly. The game strangely lacks some quality of life features like direct teleportation with submenus to go straight to small teleport altar locations, saving anywhere, quickly swappable equipment presets, having a favorites section to quickly access the better pets instead of having to menu a bunch to summon all of them. You can skip the training minigames for lesser rewards, but you can go f*** yourself if you think you're getting anything out of that smithing minigame without slogging through it. The combat is super slow because everything has a ton of health, and it's made even slower by everything in their dog having a 5 to 10 second attack animation to play every time it does something. This can't be skipped or even sped up, which I've seen as a basic feature in RPG Maker games of all things. This results in long stretches where you just watch combat happen with no real input. Similar problem with the cutscenes. You can only skip so much dialogue, but there's plenty of animations and dialogue you can't skip over.
It's like they went into things and were like, what if we just wasted 10 minutes of the player's time here?
Glass cannon build is not really feasible since every enemy is so tanky, and you either have to do slow fights or grind a ton and just be way over-leveled for the combat encounter. Plus, there's not really a way to know ahead of time if you're ready for a boss fight, so you might waste time losing it, or you might waste time over-grinding for it, neither of which will result in a fun fight. Not that it would be a riveting affair even if you were properly scaled for it. When you do lose a fight, you can retry, which doesn't really help if you're under-leveled, but sometimes you can retry the fight and run away, which can save some time. But why not just bring you back to right before the fight? Mind you, this doesn't apply in the ending sequence, where you might get through the first 4 fights and make it to the final boss just fine, only to get one shot and have to go all the way back to the start of the invasion sequence so you can grind some more, slog through the fights again, rewatch all the unskippable cutscene animations, and then try again. Waste of time.
Oh my god, from back in here? Yeah, if you don't have enough health to survive that, which is something you cannot possibly know in advance, then you basically just get an hour of your time wasted to go back and grind, or 30 minutes of your time wasted and go back and change the difficulty.
Ultimately, I think the devs prove by the level of polish and with some of the writing that they're absolutely capable of making a good game. So I find it absolutely bewildering how they made so many decisions that f***ed it up so bad. It's got great art and animations, and some characters and moments that, outside of the context of this game, are genuinely excellent. The feeling of growth in a vacuum is great. Unfortunately, they put all those things into a game with slow and uneventful turn-based combat, a generic story that regularly makes you feel like you're weak and useless, design decisions and missing quality of life features that waste your time, and a romance subplot so awful I spent over half the video putting off talking about it. Somehow, this game managed to get overwhelmingly positive reviews. If you don't pay attention and have never played anything engaging, you're just looking for a time waster game, or you're blind to everything but aesthetics, then I could see someone enjoying it for the cute look and the dialogue and overarching story that varies from pretty good to bottom of the barrel MCU movie. However, I don't see how anyone could take this game seriously and really enjoy it. Ultimately, there's much better options at a much better price point, and this game. Well, that about sums up my thoughts on WitchSpring R and the Followers Fall DLC, and I can't wait to never play them again after this review. If you're watching this and still want to try the game out, go ahead, but don't say I didn't warn you. If you're watching this and no longer want to try the game out, you're welcome for diving into this dumpster fire so you didn't have to. If anyone who worked on this game ever happens to watch this, please leave a comment about what the hell the writers were thinking shipping Pieberry with Justice, if you know. Other than that, help out the channel by subscribing, liking the video, or leaving a comment with your thoughts on the video or suggestions for improvements. Thanks a bundle for watching this far, and I hope you enjoyed it lots. I've been SakaiEX, and I'll see you next time. Probably.
You suck!